Welcome everybody to CEC live telecast, and it's been a long time, and I returned back to the series that we had launched on discussing key texts in social sciences and humanities. Today we are going to look at Max Weber, and we have identified one particular text by Max Weber which is called Bureaucracy. Before I go on into the actual features and characteristics of bureaucracy, I would sort of like to go back and ask some fundamental questions which have informed the manner in which we have looked at analyzing, reading, describing, commenting on the key texts by various writers in humanities and social sciences. What are these questions that have informed our treatment of looking at the text? The fundamental question which we always ask is, why do we read a text in particular? What was the purpose of reading that text? I know at the more immediate level we often read text because it is prescribed in the syllabus, but there is a more larger, longer, more invisible process behind a decision to introduce certain kind of texts in the syllabus and not introduce certain kinds of texts in the syllabus. When we began this series, for instance, we discussed that why is it that so many of our texts in the social sciences and humanities are often drawn from the West? And the answer simply was that many of these texts which have emerged in the West were dealing with the history of modernity, the manner in which modern societies, modern people live their everyday life, live out their anxieties, fulfill their desires and aspirations, face the various problems that they encounter. Since so many of these texts discussed issues of this nature, they remain valid whether it's a story about the West or whether it's a story about our country, which is India. This relationship, which has always been very complex with the West because of our colonial past and the persisting ascendancy or dominance of the West in the rest of the world, we have also made sure that we look at many of the texts which are not written by Western scholars but are written by Indian scholars. For instance, in this series we had looked at Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, we had looked at Rokea's Sultana's Dream, just for two examples. Even in those texts, they were dealing with issues of the social, of the modern social, the contemporary social, issues of inequality, issues of diversity, issues of gender rights, issues of technology, issues of modernity, issues of rationality. So therefore, when we take up the study of Weber and we say, why do we study bureaucracy, we are raising certain kind of questions which I would like you to keep in mind as this lecture progresses. Why did we start this series on text? I think I've been able to put forward in a certain summary form why we had started this series, how texts offer us insights into both the author's biography and history. So the issue that Weber was born in Germany, the issue that Weber was engaging with the issues which modern societies were raising, whether it be the increasing rationalization of society, whether it be the growth of capitalism and secular ideas, whether it be the rise and growth of bureaucracy itself. Why did I choose bureaucracy? Now again, a more immediate and a simple answer would be that bureaucracy is a topic which is very often covered in many syllabi. But that is not the way I look at any topic or at any writings of these classical theorists. I've chosen bureaucracy because while it is important for all of us to understand the modes, the rules, the norms which govern bureaucracy, it's also important that when we study bureaucracy, we locate it in the overall theoretical framework of Weber, who was interested in the institutions of modernity. And one of the key institutions of modernity was bureaucracy. Therefore, the fourth question, does the study of bureaucracy offer us a vantage point to understand modern societies? Yes would be my answer. And as we go through this text, I will return repeatedly to the four questions which I have identified. That the question of when we look at a text, like when we look at the bureaucracy, we have to locate it in the trajectory of Weber's personal biography and the larger history of modern Western societies such as Germany, within which he was located. In much of the 20th century, the issues which he has raised remains valid even as we enter the 21st century. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that whenever we look at a text, we look at the question of the history of a topic, the history of an institution, because a critical perspective, which I have maintained through all my lectures, which is so central to social sciences and humanities, always looks at any phenomena from a historical perspective. It asks, for example, why did this concept emerge? Why did this institution emerge? Now, if we look at the more concrete details of the history of bureaucracy as not as a phenomena, not as a social institution, but as an essay which Max Weber wrote, the answer is Bureaucracy was published in 1921 in German as part of Economy and Society and edited by Marian Weber. H. Goethe translated Bureaucracy in the 1930s and it was published. Some of you would have access to text libraries where you may see this particular book by H. Goethe. Some of you, and we are lucky today thanks to technology, can look at the computer, download the entire original text of Economy and Society as well as the extract on bureaucracy within it. Now, if we sort of move on to the next sections, we say that this particular text, which was translated by Goethe, was again polished, and there was a commentary made in 1946-47 in From the Max Weber by C. Wright Mills. You will recall that C. Wright Mills' Sociological Imagination was one of the key texts which we discussed in an early series. So far as we can tell, this is the first retranslation of Weber's essays since Goethe and Mills. So this history gives us a certain sense of the actual people and their lives and how they looked at these texts. It looks at the disciplinary history of how people went back and when people kept forward. We move on now to what would be called the meat of the substance of what is bureaucracy. And here I would sort of say, let's go step by step. Remember, when I put a PPT of this nature, they are the original writings of Weber. There is not a line which is astray or which is my line. So the characteristics of bureaucracy, which he divides in big, broad Roman 1, 2, 3, 4, and I begin with 1. There is the principle, he argues, there is the principle of fixed and official jurisdictional areas which are generally ordered by rules, that is, by laws or administrative regulation. Now, one of the things I've tried to emphasize repeatedly is just don't look at this as one of the characteristics of bureaucracy. Do not try and memorize it, but try and understand what exactly is this principle of fixed and official jurisdiction. That is, there are laid down rules, laid down procedures which govern administrative regulation. It is not arbitrary. Opposite of fixed, arbitrary. It does not depend on my whims and fancies. That is, whether I as an authority should or should not promote a person who is my subordinate should not depend upon my whim, should not depend on the fact whether I like that person or dislike that person, whether that person belongs to my community, linguistic or religious identity, but it should be governed by certain procedures, principle of fixed and official jurisdictional areas which are generally ordered by rules, that is, by laws of administrative regulation. Within the broad one, there are further division, and this is the small one. The regular activities required for the purpose of the bureaucracy governed structures are distributed in a fixed way as official duty. That I can only sign this document, I cannot sign another document. I cannot sign this document unless my subordinate has forwarded it in a particular fashion. It is fixed way, like when we apply for a leave in a government job, there is a procedure, and whether I can apply or not are governed by certain kinds of administrative rules which have been thought of it so that they are objective, they are impartial, they should never be used for any vindictive purposes. We now come to the big two, the characteristic of the bureaucracy. The authority to give the commands required for the discharge of these duties in a stable way and is strictly delimited by rules concerning the coercive means, physical, sacerdotal or otherwise, which may be placed at the disposal of the officials. So the commands have to be discharged in a stable way. Again, see, stable, not fixed, not arbitrary. It's not random. The opposite of stable being random. That today I want to act against some subordinate, so I can invoke any rules or change any rules. That would go against the principles of objective, neutral functions of rules which characterized bureaucracy. But, and here I move a little bit to the side, Weber had also identified that the state was that instrument which in its last resort had the coercive ability to actually physically punish, use violence legitimately. So along with the discharging of rules in a fixed fashion, you also have a certain coercive measures that if you violate these rules, if you actually do something which is against the rules, the authority has the power to punish. In a worse situation, they can actually throw you out of your job, or they can place certain disciplinary measures against you. Now we come to another aspect of the characteristic of bureaucracy. Methodological provision is made for the regular and continuous fulfillment of these duties and for the execution of the corresponding right. Only persons who have the generally regulated qualifications to serve are employed. This shows how do you recruit people in a bureaucracy. There have to be, again, stable, fixed procedures. So you would have an examination, you would have a certain kind of syllabi, you would have certain mode of evaluation, you would have a certain kind of marking, and only then the method of recruitment would be based on rules, not on whether I want to employ my nephew or whether I want to do a certain favor for my daughter or son. That would be in violation of the idea of a rational, objective mode of bureaucracy and functioning. Now, at this point where I now turn to the point where Weber talks that bureaucracy is not natural. It's not something which has always been there everywhere, across societies, across time and space. It is a historical exception that it's only in a modern capitalist society that bureaucracy becomes the norm. Permanent and public office authority with fixed jurisdiction is not the historical rule, it is the exception. Now, if you recall in our earlier discussions in many lectures, I have made a distinction between common sense taken for granted ideas about reality and social science theorizing or social science definition of a particular phenomenon. So at a common sense level, if you say, oh, bureaucracy is only about rules, or bureaucracy is only about authority or governing structures, then you would say that it always existed. It existed in Oriental regimes, it existed in feudal regimes, it existed in India during the feudal period when you would have large empires, whether the Gupta Empire, whether the Mughal Empire, you would have officers, you would have scribes, you would have various kinds of bodies which would run the administration. Now, the point that Weber is saying is that the mode of recruitment and the functioning of those scribes or those people who maintained and looked after the books or looked after the finances or looked after the administration were fundamentally different from the manner in which modern bureaucracy functions. And the argument that he says that this exception is the point I just made, is that even in large political structures, whether the ancient Orient, the Germanic and Mongolian empire of conquest, or many feudal structures of state, or Mughal, or the Gupta, or the Maurya, or the Delhi Sultanate, for example, this did not exist. Now let's go and understand why this is so. How did then those structures of state operate in an earlier regime? In all these cases, the ruler executes the most important measures through personal trustees, table companions, court servants. Their commission and authority are not precisely delimited and are temporarily called into being for each case. Now, each of these words may seem very complicated, but you must realize what it basically is saying. And you would have heard stories of, even in your family, or maybe you have read novels or poetry or seen films, that the king, for example, the Raja, the Maharaja, or maybe the Sultan, is happy with somebody. Now, when they are happy with somebody, they may take a decision that I am going to give you so much jagir or so much land, I am going to make you my administrator. This decision is completely random, dependent upon the will and the desire of the authority, which could be the Sultan or the king. Likewise, the king or the Sultan or the Maharaja or the Nawab may suddenly decide they don't like that person they had recruited, and they said, off with your head, like you are no longer in my service, I can banish you from my land. This is fundamentally different from the manner in which rationality or rational laws, law-bound societies, questions of bureaucracy operate. Even if somebody has done something which is an omission of law, a violation of law, there would be rules to say there has to be an inquiry committee, there has to be adjudication, there has to be certain procedures. Likewise, if you have to enter the administrative services of a public body like a government or a private body like a corporate company, you have to enter through certain procedures. Advertisements would be placed, certain number of days would be given before you apply, and once you apply, there would be certain qualifications of eligibility, there would be shortlisting done, there would be experts commissioned, there would be procedures by which they would assess whether you fit in or do not fit in. And these procedures would be constant, they would be fixed and stable, they wouldn't be erratic. It couldn't be that for you there would be certain procedures and for somebody else there would be certain other procedures. So this is very, very important, fundamentally different from the bureaucracy as it functions today and the structures of administrations which functioned before. Now, only a social science and a historical perspective would be able to distinguish between the power exercised by a traditional feudal regime and a modern liberal democratic state. Only a social science and a comparative perspective would be able to distinguish between the manner in which power operates in a traditional society and power operates in a modern society. Only a social science perspective would be able to distinguish between how the administrative structure operates, who is recruited, what is the criteria of recruitment, what are the procedures, what are the eligibility criteria. Now, is it possible that you are not a graduate and you can apply for a job which has strictly said that a minimum qualification is a graduate. You can't. Or if a violation is done, you can go to the court, you can complain and say, look, they had said eligibility criteria minimum BA and they've actually recruited somebody who doesn't have it. But in a traditional society, this is not how it works, because there it depends upon the absolute power of the absolute rule. That is where the distinction between an authoritarian regime and a democratic regime operates. Yes, in both power exists. Yes, in both rules exist, but the manner in which power and rules exist are very, very different. So in our everyday life, we may say that he's our boss and the boss knows the best, but the boss, if the boss errs, the boss is also accountable. If the boss does something wrong, the boss can also be called to book. That is not true in a traditional society. You can't call the boss, which is the Maharaja, to book, whereas you can call a minister to accountability, because that is where the modes by which a modern democratic state operates. I sort of moved a little bit to explain to you that it's not enough to know just the principles of bureaucracy, but also very important to understand why, while we study bureaucracy, it offers us a vantage point to understand modernity, to understand modern laws, to understand modern rules, and to understand how the modern state is fundamentally different from a traditional authoritarian state. Now we go back to some other principles of official hierarchy. In a bureaucracy, hierarchy is very important. The principle of official hierarchy and of levels of graded authority mean a firmly ordered system of super and subordination in which there is a supervision of the lower offices by the higher ones. Very often in your textbook you will see that a hierarchy is explained as something which is of a pyramidal structure, something which goes like this, and you have accountability, So the person who's at the top is also accountable to somebody, and then below him you have various kinds of people who all have graded authority, that some people are entitled only to do this and some others. The hierarchy is not arbitrary. Our society, for example, we know is hierarchical. But the official hierarchy is very different from a caste hierarchy or a class hierarchy. Official hierarchy is bound by rules, are governed by procedures, firmly ordered system of super and subordination in which there is a supervision of the lower offices by the higher ones. Such a system offers the government the possibility of appealing the decision of a lower office to its higher authority in a definitely regulated manner. I'd like to draw your attention that how repeatedly they're going back to the question of regulation, regulated authority, the possibility of appealing to the decision of a lower office to its higher authority in a definitely regulated manner. Everywhere, the emphasis is on stable, emphasis is on fixed, emphasis is on regulated. It is not arbitrary, it is not random. The principle of official hierarchy cuts across private and public administrative structures. The principle of hierarchical office authority is found in all bureaucratic structures, in state and ecclesiastical structure, as well as in large party organizations and private enterprise. The argument that Weber is making, remember every text which is on your PPT is directly from Weber. What he is arguing is that the principle of this official hierarchy, that pyramidal structure, can exist in both private as well as in public organization. So you can have a bureaucracy which is of the Indian government. When we say Indian bureaucracy, the Indian IAS or the IPS, the kind of services, but we also can have a hierarchy and the same principle operating in a private cooperative firm. Maybe it's a private sector firm where you would have the same principle. Now I come to a very interesting feature of bureaucracy and something which all of you are familiar. I recall as a child that every time one thought that one can play office, that you would need some files in front of you. The idea that files are so central to bureaucracy that even a child would recognize that an office means files. But there is a deeper question. What exactly are these files and why do they exist? The management of the modern office is based upon written documents, the files, which are presented in the original or draft form. There is therefore a staff of subaltern officials and scribes of all sorts. So filing is not just paperwork, but paperwork of a certain kind, a certain order. I'll give you a small example. Maybe it's an application that you would want to go on leave because maybe, as a woman, you're expecting a child, a maternity leave, and you apply for leave. First, that leave has to be forwarded by your immediate, the person who is above you, that is subordinate, not subordinate, the opposite, and they have to check whether you are entitled to that leave or not, that maybe you have already availed of it and you're not entitled to it. So they have to check on your personal file. All of you would be familiar that there would be a record of your personal files. How many leave have you taken? How many leave have you not taken? Once, say, for example, they've checked that and they say, yes, you are entitled to it, and your subordinate, your boss, so to say, marks it. It then goes somewhere else, who again checks and then moves forward, finally to the person who sanctions it. Okay. Now everybody, every person, every office or officer through which this file is moving has to sign. There is a certain kind of order in this process, and supposing later on they find that something went wrong, they can go back and check it, and it will be very simple. There has been notings, what are called notings in the file. Maybe you are not sure that is this person entitled to it, and then you mark a noting. Maybe it is a file about purchasing certain kinds of instruments or very expensive products, and then again you're not sure about it, so you put down your query in the column. This is to ensure that if somebody sees that query, there'll be double check. There'll be double check to ensure that there is no violation or a mistake. So in its ideal form, and if you remember, Weber is another thinker who used the idea of the ideal form as it ought to be. It may not work out exactly like that in real life, but in its ideal form, the files ensure that there is a certain transparency and there is also a certain kind of double check to make the possibility of errors minimum. Now, apart from that, we come to another aspect, and this separation of the office from the private domicile. I'll develop the argument. I'll first read it out and then we're going to explain it. Because just a little while ago, we said the bureaucracy can exist both in the public realm as well as in the private realm. Now we are again using the concept of private and the office, but in a slightly different way. In principle, the modern organization of the civil service separates the bureau from the private domicile of the official, and in general, bureaucratic segregations, official activity is something distinct from the sphere of private life. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on this question of the separation from the official from the private, the separation from what is called the public domain from the private. This distinction was not so strong or not there in earlier pre-modern feudal regimes. For example, it was very common across the world, not just in India, across the world, that you have the kings who conquer, there is war, and the conqueror decides to marry off some women from the land they have conquered. marriage alliances were very much part of it. So you married, your private life was another way by which you expanded your public influence. You go back to our epics, you go back to what happened in Western world, you go back to when the colonizers came here, that marriage and marriage transactions, which in the contemporary times we see as something deeply personal, deeply private, were very much part of the deals of public transactions. Maybe it still works, but that's a question which I sort of leave hanging. Just a small example, say in Bombay, or what is called Mumbai, the Bombay Presidency, you would be very familiar that this was something which the British got from the Portuguese, and there was a marriage transaction which the Portuguese had got it at a particular point of time. These are the histories of a pre-modern world where you did not have the separation of the office from the private or the private domicile. So in a traditional society, India, which is a complex mix of the modern and the traditional, very often we have hired domestic workers who were traditionally called servants within the private realm. They were not exposed or covered by the kind of rules and procedures which would govern our function as a public servant in the bureaucracy, whether in the state or in the private realm. Now, increasingly you have demands, for example, in our country, that they too, domestic workers too, ought to be governed by certain rules of recruitment, rules of financial guarantee, rules of leave transaction. And many of us who are used to the idea that they should not, they are at our beck and call, find this astonishing. Yet we do not find it astonishing that we ourselves should be governed by certain kinds of rules or procedures. So in principle, the modern organization of the civil service separates the bureau means the office, from the private domicile of the official, and in general, bureaucratic segregates official activity as something different from the sphere of private life. The Indian context, the study of bureaucracy, does not only offer us an insight into the study of modern rational system, but also offers us a vantage point to look into the manner in which bureaucracy operates in a society which is deeply traditional, deeply feudal, deeply governed by the idea that it's my business what I do. If I'm the boss, I have the authority to recruit who I wish. And in our country, we have a history very often where recruitment is formally done through procedures but which is often maybe used or misused to recruit people who may be related, recruit people who belong to my community, or even recruit people who may have shared political, cultural, religious views. Now, technically, the manner in which Weber talks about bureaucracy, this is not how it ought to be. But because in our society, because of our colonial history of mediated modernity, of a history of feudalism which did not end, even as capitalism arose, we have a mix of very strong feudal belief system, feudal institutional practices, coupled with modern bureaucratic rational systems. As a sociologist or as anybody who may be wanting to join the services, it is a fascinating way of how these two worldviews or two kind of practices belonging to very different kinds of realms operate together. To go on with this example, very often therefore you have histories and stories. I think you may have followed in the newspaper. There was a particular person who was in the foreign services who had hired a domestic worker and violated certain norms of basic right-based treatment of equality or whatever. And the idea was, can you do it? Can you use your public location as a standing as a public servant and use public goods or services for your private benefit? This is actually a huge contradiction which governs our life. I think it governs many countries, but perhaps countries for whose history of modernity was mediated through colonialism and whose histories of modernity did not mean a complete banishment of feudalism as it did in many other parts of the world. Public monies and equipment are therefore divorced from the private property of the official. This condition is everywhere the product of a long development. Again, if you look at this term, if you look back at all the text, for I have been able to only extract parts and presented it as a PPT, because the idea of the text series was to tempt you to look at the original text, that this idea, that this distinction between that this is my official car, I must not use my official car to go for a picnic. This is my official maybe certain kind of equipment. I shouldn't use it in my domestic sphere. This distinction is very modern. And this distinction very often does not make sense to people who have been socialized under the understanding that what is yours, whether it is public or whether it is private. And Weber mentions the condition is everywhere the product of a long development, this segregation of the public and the private. I want you to pay attention to the story of the product of a long development, because it means that you need a long historical procedure, for this awareness that all of us are governed by the same rules. We can't pull our private status when confronted with public violation. All of you are familiar, and there have been wonderful memes and jokes and advertisements about how in our country very often we pull our rank. So you get caught violating the red light, and the traffic police person comes to you, and your response is, "Don't you know who I am? Main kaun hu?" And what does it mean? Whose son or whose daughter I am. You're pulling your private identity in order to negotiate your public life, which should be governed by rules and norms which are equal across board. We move on now to yet another characteristic of bureaucracy, characteristic of office management. At least all specialized office management, such management is distinctly modern, usually presupposes thorough and expert training. Expertise is very, very important in a modern bureaucracy or in a modern corporation. Your private company, they need particular people trained in computer software, maybe they need IT professionals. You can't get in there unless you have your expertise. You can't get that job unless you have those specialized expert training. Expert training and division of training and division of labor are very much part of modernity, which takes us back to the point I've argued before, the point that any of these features, when we study bureaucracy, we have to study bureaucracy not as an entity which is independent of itself. We have to study it also as something which gives us a certain vantage point to understand how modernity operates. And modern societies, as we have looked at, whether we looked at Marx or Weber or Durkheim, is marked by division of labor, greater specialization, expert training. And expert training, therefore, you must know your job, and that knowing is not by apprenticeship. Apprenticeship, that in a traditional society you learned to be a goldsmith by apprenticing with somebody who is a goldsmith. You wouldn't have a certain course which trained you to be a jeweler. Apprenticeship is then replaced by professional courses, professional training, which provides you with certain kind of expert training. Not only that, once you're recruited, whether in the state bureaucracy, or maybe private bureaucracy, or maybe international organizational bureaucracy, there would be repeated training provisions given to you of how to be a particular official, how to conduct your business. In the Indian context, all of you would be familiar that Indian context, when a person is recruited, say for the Union Public Service Commission, which again is rule bound, governed by certain norms, and once you're recruited and appointed, depending upon where you are appointed in, you would be sent to training institutes, whether you're a police or maybe an administrator or revenue person, an accounts person, you would be sent to institutions which are specialized, which would train you in a particular fashion. And even as you move on in your job, you would come back to be retrained. You would be having orientation, reorientation, maybe mid-career training programs. The expertise is very, very important. We now move on to another aspect of the characteristic of bureaucracy, the idea of DLimitation. Let me read this out. When the office is fully developed, official activity demands the full working capacity of the official, irrespective of the fact that his obligatory time in the bureau may be firmly delimited. Formerly, in all cases, official business was discharged as a secondary activity. What does it mean? Again, this paragraph from Weber gives us an insight about how people discharge their duties at an earlier period of time. Now, what it means is that once, say, I am recruited, maybe I'm a district magistrate. I have qualified, I have been now an IAS officer, and I'm a district magistrate. I am a district magistrate 24/7. That is my fundamental identity. That is not just my official identity, which ceases to be when I go to sleep or leave my office. It is bound on me. This job or the business is my primary duty, my primary obligation. Very often, I belong to a much older generation. I remember, conflicts within the family with grandparents. And the young people would say that I have to go, I can't attend this ceremony. Maybe it's a wedding ceremony, maybe it's an engagement ceremony of a relative. I have office work and I will not get leave. I have to go there. In which case, your official identity takes precedence over your personal or private identity. And a granduncle or a grandmother or a grandfather would say, I don't understand this. Where is your priority? Who do you owe your loyalty to? Is your job more important than your family obligation? Is the family not more important than the job? Now, giving this example, let's return to this characteristic of bureaucracy, and perhaps when we now read it, you will get a sense of exactly what we meant. When the office is fully developed, meaning historically we have acquired that kind of rule-bound governance, separation of public and private, official activity demands the full working capacity of the official, irrespective of the fact that the obligatory time in the bureau may be firmly delimited. Firmly delimited, actually I should be in office only from 10 to 5. But you would find out from any, since we gave the example of a DM or maybe a private person who works in a private firm, that very often the work hours are extended. They have to finish their job. Formally, however, the example I gave you of a traditional society, it is the family or your obligation as a member of a clan or a community or an ethnicity, a tribe, which becomes much more important. The official business is a secondary activity. We now come to another aspect of the characteristic of bureaucracy, which we have already emphasized at different points of time. The management of the office follows general rules, which are more or less stable, more or less exhaustive, and which can be learned. Again, rules, general rules. More or less stable, not random, not arbitrary. More or less exhaustive, it covers all aspects of your functioning, and it can be learned. So as you enter a job, there is a lot of learning which takes place, and those learnings are governed by certain general rules. It's not just random, So a person who's been in the government for long is familiar with administrative laws, They would know, suppose you are not sure of a particular rule and you ask somebody who's been there in the job for long and you ask them, and they would probably have an answer. You would be familiar, many of you may be doing courses on modern public administration. This is what they see, and this is very different from patrimonialism. Patrimonialism, what would govern traditional society, that I am the patriarch, I feel good towards you, I'm entitled, I am governed by my traditional obligation as a patriarch to look after you. Governed by customary mores, customary norms, not written laws, whereas public administration is governed by written laws. The theory of public administration, for instance, assumes that the authority to order certain matters by decree, which has been legally granted to public authorities, does not entitle the Bureau to regulate the matter by commands given for each case, but only to regulate the matter abstractly. The theory of public administration assumes the authority to order certain matters by decree. That is, you can give an order, but it's not random. It can't be said that I don't like you, you are sacked. Nothing like that can happen. This, even if I take a decision to get rid of somebody or to sack somebody, it has to be legally granted to me as a sanctioning authority. And even then, I have to give a show cause, I have to follow certain procedures to do so. It can't be on my whims that I have decided to do it and so I shall. That is not something which would be possible. It does not. So you have, again, I repeat, and this is part of the reason why we did key text, that you learn to read carefully, go back to it, break it up and look. The theory of public administration, for instance, assumes that the authority to order certain matters by decree, which has been legally granted to public authorities, does not entirely entitle the Bureau, does not entitle the Bureau to regulate the matter by commands given for each case, but only to regulate the matter abstractly. So I can't say, what does it mean, regulate each case or regulate abstractly? It means that I can't say I don't like this girl, so I shall invoke this law to fix her, or I don't like this girl, so I shall not promote her. It is not person dependent. It's not person dependent. It is dependent by laws which are abstract, which govern across everybody. This goes back because in our earlier classes we talked about democratic theory. The question that everybody, it rests on the idea of equality. It rests on the idea of impersonal laws which govern everybody. This stands in extreme contrast to the regulation of all relationships through individual privileges and bestowals of favor, which is absolutely dominant in patrimonialism, at least insofar as such relationships are not fixed by sacred tradition. So the idea of the sacred, the idea is so, in contrast, we go back to Durkheim, is different from the idea of the profane. This is the realm of the profane, the bureaucracy, where rules operate, laws operate. It can't be that we would say, I bestow you this title. From today, you have this particular title. You are familiar in our country very often, in the feudal periods, in our India, people would be granted lands, and owners of certain land would be given certain titles. So many of us would have titles or surnames which are not identity based in terms of, but based upon grants of titles which were bequeathed to you by the ruler. He had the authority to do so. This is not possible in a democratic society, where even the ruler is governed by certain rules and norms. In a worse situation, the ruler can be summoned and made accountable. Look, that you have violated. Therefore, you have various divisions in the state, the executive, the judiciary, the legislature, which are checks on each other. So here it's completely different, and therefore Weber says historical exception. He says it stands in extreme contrast to the regulation of all relationships through individual privilege and bestowals of favor, which is absolutely dominant in patrimonialism, at least insofar as such relationships are not fixed by sacred tradition. Now, favor, doing somebody a favor, would be considered not correct by modern laws or rules. Then do me this favor, please. Whereas in our society, very often we are seeking favors. Seeking favor means that the person who will grant you the favor will be more partial towards you, which goes against the spirit of democracy or the spirit of fixed norms and rules of accountability by which the bureaucracy operates. Now I come to the tail end of my lecture, and I want to have a general discussion, and I have one particular question which I have marked in the PPT, my final one, on some observations. How does this text help us understand modernity in general and Indian modernity in particular? I repeat, how does the text help us to understand modernity in general and Indian modernity in particular? I am ending with this question because one of the purpose of doing key texts was to make you understand and read the text in a more critical fashion. To understand how bureaucracy would help you to understand the way modernity functions in general and modernity in contemporary period, maybe we need to go back and look at how all the classical writers, whether it's Marx or Durkheim or Weber, looked at modernity. It's a point that I've repeatedly mentioned in my earlier lectures, that all these writers, many of them through the 19th and 20th century life experiences, were involved with the new social institutions which was taking place. Marx, for example, and we've had discussions on German ideology, we've had discussions on Communist Manifesto, we've had discussions on Durkheim's division of labor, or even suicide. We're looking at how society moved from status to contrast. How you had a shift to a situation where the idea of equal persons or bound by wage labor, that everybody was equal, came into being. So with democratic norms, with the idea of specialization and efficiency, you also needed a certain administrative structure which worked in tandem. And this is the story of bureaucracy, and this is how the study of bureaucracy offers us a vantage point to understand modernity in general and Indian modernity in particular. Thank you very much.